My God, how do you follow an introduction like that? It's rhetorical suicide to speak after this gentleman. I remember listening to the great Rex Murphy when I was but a teenager growing up in 299 Shaughnessy Drive in southwest Calgary, and he would give his take late night on CBC, which was the only reason why anybody could suffer through Peter Mansbridge, is so that they could get to Rex Murphy afterwards. And he was always worth the wait, as is the case today. One of the great wordsmiths and one of the great treasures of our nation. Yes, give him a round of applause for that. You can tell a lot about a man by the boots he wears. Mark is a welder in St. John's, Newfoundland, and his boots are wrapped in tape because despite the holes in them, he can't afford to buy new ones. He's a welder who earns about $55,000 a year, which used to be respectable money. In fact, he says it's a good salary that just can't buy anything anymore. He told me at my rally 48 hours ago in St. John's that he spends about $400 a week on gas, and at around 34, 35 years of age, he lives with his mother and his sister because he can't afford a home. He talks about how his most immediate wish in life would be to help his family pay their bills, just to stay in the house they have. Forget about the dream that you used to take for granted that someone that age might live in his own home and start his own family. You see, Mark's problem is that he lives in the wrong Canada. There's actually two of them now. On the one side of the fence are the privileged few who live in inflating assets that go up year after year in value by doing nothing at all, sitting on their big fat assets. As government pumps more and more money into the economy to inflate the price of everything that exists. Now, those people who have get richer and richer, and they sit back reading their Globe and Mail articles, wondering why it is that there are so many angry people like Mark with his taped up boot. They don't realize that the same forces that have made their house prices double in 7 years have made Mark's paycheck fall by half in the same period of time when you look at its purchasing power. Now, you might find it ironic that the very people who hold these elitist views are also on what we call the political left. They subscribe to the big redistributive agenda that was supposedly meant to create social justice and income and wealth equality, yet they are profiting from the system that is driving the larger and larger gap between the rich and the poor. The reality is, for people like that, income inequality was actually never the purpose of their political agenda. That was just a talking point designed to justify the real purpose, which was to enhance and grow the power and might of the state. Now, why? Because they are the people who have influence over the state, and therefore they become grander and better off when the state is grander and better off. In reality, they're not against capitalism, they're against free market capitalism. They're in favor of a kind of state capitalism where wealth is distributed by politics. Those that have the political power decide who gets what. Put more crassly, those who are not at the table are on the menu, right? See, politics, the political spectrum is nothing like what it is described to be. The difference between a government-controlled economy, socialism, and a free market economy is really the difference between force and freedom. The more the state controls the economy, the more its resources are distributed by force. The more that the market controls the economy, the more the resources are distributed by voluntary exchange. Let me give you an example. You walk into a coffee shop, you buy a cup of coffee, you pay for the coffee, you say thank you when you get it. And what does the person behind the till say? Not you're welcome. They say thank you back. It's the double thank you. Why? Because both people are better off. You're better off because you have the $2.50 coffee. The coffee shop is better off because they have the $2.50. If you have an apple and want an orange, and I have an orange and want an apple, and we trade, we still have an apple and orange between us, but we're both better off because each has something worth more to him than he had before. That's why people say thank you. Now, by contrast, everything the government does in its transactions, it does by force. That's why nobody writes thank you on their tax forms, right? Because though it is theoretically a transaction, a purchase of goods and service, it was not done voluntarily. The idea that an economy based on force would favor the less fortunate is on the face of it ridiculous. Relationships based on force always favor the powerful. The great economist James Buchanan invented something called public choice theory. And basically he said human nature does not change regardless of the system in which people operate. All of the same self-interest and corresponding generosity exists in equal measure. So if you think people are going to be greedy in a government-based economy, or in a free market economy, they're going to be just as greedy, if not more, in a government economy. And that is what we are seeing now. The government is inflating the wealth of the privileged while robbing the wages of the working class. And the two sides are separated by the gatekeepers, who want to keep the privileged in and everyone else out. So Rex mentioned the big crowds that we've been getting at my rallies. Over 40,000 people have RSVP'd for them. Here's the reality. You want to know why the people are coming to my rallies with such enthusiasm? For the same reason that the elites are fighting my candidacy with equal enthusiasm, because they see in me, for once, finally someone who's going to change things for real. That's what's happening. So let's start with inflation. So $1 in every $5 in the economy today was created in the last 2 years. The governor of the Bank of Canada agreed to become Justin Trudeau's personal ATM machine. Right? He agreed to print 3/4 of the deficit so that Trudeau wouldn't have to go to the real lending markets and get the money from real people. So what happened? Well, more dollars chase fewer goods, which always means higher prices. This is the oldest story in economics. It goes back thousands of years. We know the great stories of Henry VIII and the great inflation that he caused. He was very creative. He used to clip off the edge of the British pound so that he could melt down those edges and make more coins. And then when that didn't work, because there were no more edges to clip off, he had his minters melt down the silver and put the insides filled with copper. His face was on the front of those coins. And so when his nose, which protruded straight out of the coin, would rub against the pant legs of his subjects, all of the silver would run off and he'd have a red nose. And that's why they call him Old Copper Nose. He increased the number of British pounds in circulation by 80% in 6 years. Guess what happened to the cost of everything? It went up by exactly 80%. This is not new. And when I predicted it in the Finance Committee, and all of the elites snickered, I wasn't saying anything especially ingenious. I was stating the patently obvious. So what are we going to do about it? How are we going to put an end to this system that favors undeserving few at the expense of the hardworking many? Well, one, we're going to tackle the inflation by tackling its causes. We will eliminate the inflationary deficits. I will cut the $100 billion slush fund Trudeau has stacked on top of his spending. I will eliminate the multi-billion-dollar infrastructure bank. We need a bank. We need infrastructure. We don't need a bank. All that does is guarantee the profits of large corporations, while at the same time putting the burden on the taxpayer. And we'll save $1 billion by defunding the CBC, which is an easy one. Finally, we're going to run our government the way you run your business, which is to say if you need an extra dollar to spend, you have to find a dollar of savings to pay for it with a new pay-as-you-go law. The Americans brought it in the 90s. They balanced the budget, paid off $400 billion of debt, and that allowed them to reestablish their finances. As soon as that law was lapsed by Congress, they went right back into deficit. We need that kind of law to impose discipline here because, as the great Thomas Sowell said, the number one rule of economics is scarcity. The number one rule of politics is to ignore the number one rule of economics. Right? Politicians are the only creatures in the universe that don't have to live with scarcity because they always just pass it on in higher taxes, debt, and inflation. Well, we're going to re-internalize that scarcity with a pay-as-you-go law that will limit spending. But we also have to impose discipline on our central banking system. The abuses of the last 2 years cannot be allowed to repeat themselves. The Governor of the Bank of Canada, if he were truly independent, would have looked the Prime Minister in the eye and he would have said, "No, Mr. Prime Minister, I'm not printing the money to pay for your deficit. You go get the money the regular way. My job is to protect the purchasing power of money and to keep inflation low." He had one job: target inflation at 2%. What happens to Mark in St. John's when he doesn't do his job? He gets fired. So what should happen to the Governor of the Bank of Canada when he doesn't do his job? He should be fired, and I will fire him when I'm Prime Minister. And I will replace him with someone who will be independent and who will institute the purpose of the bank, which is to protect the purchasing power of our money. I'll give the Auditor General the power to audit the central bank, and furthermore, this idea of creating a central bank digital currency where you'd actually deposit your money in a government bank account. Didn't we see what politicians would do if they had the chance to abuse the power over people's bank accounts with the use of the Emergency Act? How many of you would like to be able to deposit your money in a government bank account which they could surveil, which they could manipulate, for which they could provide special benefits to special voting groups or special interest groups? I don't think that's the way we're going to preserve economic freedom or privacy in this country, so I will ban the government from instituting a central bank digital currency. You know, instead of creating more cash, we've got to create more of what cash buys, which is what all of you do here today. You are the entrepreneurs who make things and generate the wealth that money purchases. If instead of creating an extra dollar, we created an extra loaf of bread, we would actually increase the purchasing power of the nation. So how do we do that? Well, we need to remove the government gatekeepers that, for example, stand in the way of our energy sector in this country. We have the third biggest supply of oil on earth, and yet we're importing 130,000 barrels of oil every single day from overseas. I will repeal C-69, the anti-energy law, to build Canadian pipelines with Canadian steel in this country. We will approve projects quickly, not just oil, but also gas. With the 1,300 trillion cubic feet we have of natural gas in this country that we could be shipping over to Asia because BC is the closest point in North America to Asia, or to Europe because Newfoundland is the closest point in Europe to Europe in North America. And of course we have an incredible advantage in cooling natural gas into a liquid, don't we? Because we have so much cold weather here. It's actually 25% cheaper to liquefy gas in Canada than in the Gulf Coast. It gets so cold in this country, Rex, that the Prime Minister was seen over the last winter with his hands in his own pockets, the truth be told. But the Newfoundlanders, back in your own province, Rex, they have a plan to increase oil production by 400,000 barrels a day. A Poliev government will approve that. We will use the oil to fully displace overseas oil from Canada, and I will ban dictator oil from Canada altogether within 5 years. I'll incentivize the provinces and municipalities towards the goal of having the fastest building permits in the developed world. Right now, we have fewer houses per capita than any other G7 country, even though we have the most land to build on. That's why Mark can't find a house, right? There aren't enough of them. Why can't we build them? Because local bureaucrats stand in the way, pile on taxes, fees, delays, charges, consulting contracts, and so on, all of which goes onto the backs of the home buyer. Well, why don't we incentivize our local municipalities to speed it up? I'm going to say to our big city mayors, if you want more infrastructure money, you have to get out of the way, because I'll be paying out many of the infrastructure dollars on the basis of how many houses actually get built, and we will sell off 15% of the federal buildings that are already underutilized, in many cases altogether empty, so that they can be turned into housing units. And it warms my heart to think of all the wonderful, smiling families that will be moving in to the newly vacated CBC headquarters in downtown Toronto. And then there's the gatekeepers that stand in the way of our newcomers. We have thousands of qualified immigrants that could be working as doctors, engineers, plumbers, electricians, but they get wrapped up in the provincial gatekeepers who won't grant them licenses to work. So the federal government gives money for immigration settlement to the provinces. I'm going to say that the provinces are going to have to pass a mandate that their local professional bodies must give a yes-no answer to our immigrants when they apply to work in their profession within 60 days, and that yes or no should be granted on the basis of skills testing, not on the basis of where the immigrant comes from. And if they fall just short of qualifying, I'm going to back up 30,000 small loans for them to study, get qualified, pass the test to get a license, so we can have more doctors, more lawyers, more electricians, more engineers, more inflation-proof paychecks for our immigrants right across this country. You see, when we remove the gatekeepers, it's actually the people that are traditionally thought of as disadvantaged who benefit the most. The First Nations, who want to lift themselves out of poverty with more commerce and development on reserve. I want to give them the chance to opt out of the Indian Act and give themselves control of their money, their land, and their resources to approve projects in the interests of their people and build a better future for themselves. These are the opportunities that await us. If we can remove the gatekeepers and stand on the side of the people who work hard and build this nation. You know, when I travel across this country, the one thing I notice in common about all of the people who attend my events is they feel like they've lost control of their lives. Whether they can't afford to live or whether they've been bossed around and had their medical freedoms robbed from them over the last 2 years, they fundamentally feel like they've lost control to big, bossy government. Mark Twain said the two most important days in your life are the day that you're born and the day you realize why you were born. Why is the most important question you should ever ask. Why am I running for Prime Minister? It's very simple. I'm running for Prime Minister to put you back in control of your life by making Canada the freest nation on earth. That is my purpose. And speaking of freedom, there's also free speech. In fact, Jocelyn, she called me the other day and said, Pierre, do you believe in free speech? I said, yes. She said, how would you like to give one? And that's how I ended up here today. But, we need to restore free speech in this country. Trudeau's now got this bill, C-11, which combined with his planned creation of a digital harms commissioner. This is someone who's going to be scouring the internet for anything he considers to be harmful. Not criminal. Everything criminal is already criminal if you do it online. So if you're thinking about doing a crime, you think you're going to get away with it just because you're doing it on the internet, you're going to get arrested. That's already the case. This is stuff that this commissioner believes will ultimately be societally harmful if allowed to stay online. He'll be able to pull it down. The Twitter Corporation actually wrote the government of Canada and said, if you do this, you will be exclusively in the company of Iran, North Korea, and Communist China with that level of control over the internet, right? And Trudeau says, well, he needs to do this to protect us all from misinformation. Right? This is the guy who still has on his Liberal Party website that the budget was balanced in 2019, right? But, this issue, this idea that government can tackle misinformation suggests that when you take a person and put him into a role as a government censor, he suddenly becomes an angel who can be trusted as an arbiter of truth. If we believe that man is so broken that he needs to be censored, well then how can he be so angelic that he can be capable of being a just censor of others? It is absolutely a contradiction. Of course there's misinformation. Often it's spread by government, but sometimes it will be spread by ordinary people who read something online that isn't true and they spread it around. I remember I was at a rally in North Bay the other day, and this lady started screaming at me right in the middle of my speech. And we actually thought we weren't going to be able to finish the speech. And then because she was that out of control, and then she started screaming at my wife. And my wife doesn't let anybody scream at her. So she was very calm. We went outside to do a photo line. And this lady comes down the line, and she's screaming again. And she started accusing my wife of all kinds of crazy things that she'd read about on the internet. And I thought, oh my goodness, Anna's going to let her have it now. But Anna was so calm, and she took this lady by the hand and point by point corrected every falsehood. And then she took the lady aside and said, "Why are you so angry?" And the lady said, "Because I lost my 2 sons to fentanyl overdoses, and I don't trust anyone anymore." Fentanyl is a medically prescribed drug. So you can imagine that this woman would have reacted when the state came along and told her she had to put something in her body as a result of the pandemic. Agree with her if you want, disagree with her if you want. You can understand why she might be just a little bit suspicious the next time she was told she had to do something for medical reasons. And my wife and this lady held each other in their arms, 2 mothers, and sobbed as they shared in the sadness of this woman's story. And afterwards, I pulled my wife aside and I said, "How did you know to be so calm and gracious to this woman?" And she said to me, "Because when I looked in her eyes, even in that hall while she was screaming, I didn't see hate. I didn't even see anger. I saw pain." Ladies and gentlemen, there are people in this country that are just hanging on by a thread right now. They don't need to be called unacceptable. They don't need to be called the fringe. They don't need to be censored. If they make a mistake, it is the duty of public representatives like myself to be their servant and answer their questions, relieve their concerns, and bring forward some humility to their lives, and maybe even just a little bit of hope that things can get better in the future. And what that story reminded me of is that freedom actually unites people. Control does the opposite. Why? Because there's only 100% control. If one person has more control, someone else has to have yet less. It's a zero-sum game. People fight over control, they fight for freedom. Freedom is not in finite supply. There's always enough for everybody. If your neighbor is more free, you are more free. If your Muslim friend has more religious freedom, you as a Jew, a Christian, or a Sikh will have more religious freedom. If your local small business has freedom from red tape, you'll probably have the freedom to buy his goods more affordably, and your teenager might have the freedom to have a job working for him. If the immigrant doctor has the freedom to work in his profession, you'll have the freedom to have a doctor. So instead of divide and conquer, we should in this country unite for freedom, and that's the purpose of my campaign. So, and in the conclusion, I want to quote a great Canadian Prime Minister, someone who was also derided by the elites, but who spoke for the great masses. His favorite saying, of course, was, "Everyone's against me except the people." John Diefenbaker. When he signed, yes, give him a round of applause for Dief the Chief. He signed the great Canadian Bill of Rights. He said, "I am a Canadian, a free Canadian, free to speak without fear, free to stand for what I think right, free to oppose what I think wrong, free to worship God in my own way. It is this heritage of freedom I pledge to uphold for myself and for all of mankind." Thank you very much. Thank you.
I think we've just seen the next Prime Minister. Folks, it's my honor and privilege to award the Game Changer of the Year award to Pierre. The reason for it, we have probably called on Pierre about 25, 30, 35 times at the Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers and Businesses to host Zoom calls, to talk about various issues, to talk about problems the business is having, to talk about how to keep jobs in Canada, and he's responded every single time, and there is no politician that we've ever spoken to that has been that receptive. So Pierre, thank you so much. We'd like to present the Game Changer of the Year award to you. Well deserved. And folks, for anybody who hasn't seen the new video that Pierre put out a couple of days ago with Jordan Peterson and Pierre speaking for 2 hours straight on issues, it's a must-watch. You gotta watch that. Gotta go on YouTube and check it out. They will be studying that video for decades to come in political science classes. We here wish you all the best of luck on your trails. I know it's grueling and gruesome, but you have done such a fantastic job for us, and continue please to fight for freedom, because it gives me great hope that the country will do just fine with talent like yours representing us. Thank you, Pierre. There you go. Thank you.